Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Reish Mem Daled Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn the halachas of Eruvei Chatzeros. We pick up today on the very top line of Reish Mem Daled Amud Aleph with Siman Shin Ayin Daled Sif Beis. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanisunim Batzara Ubashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleha V'Yetziam Yitzar L'Rvacha. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Achi Hagadol, Moshe ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak ben Zion ben Dirshu, Rivka b'Ashir Leah, Chava Hadassah bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, and Yerucham ben Masha. They should all have a refuah shalema b'Sag Shar Chayla Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way, b'chol makom shehem. All right, so here in Siman Shin Ayin Daled, we have been discussing cases where we have two chatzeros. There was a mechitza between them, and obviously that mechitza has very powerful ramifications in the halachas of Eruvei Chatzeros, and now something changed. Previously, in Sif Aleph, we spoke about where there was an opening in the mechitza, and that opening allowed the two chatzeros to join in a joint Eruvei Chatzeros. Now today we're going to discuss kind of the opposite. We're going to discuss where there was a mechitza without an opening, so they could not join in a joint Eruvei Chatzeros, and now something happened to that mechitza. What are the ramifications of that change? Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, top line, Reish Mem Daled Amud Aleph. Haya kaisel ben shtei chatzeros. There was a wall separating two chatzeros. Therefore, they cannot join in a joint Eruvei Chatzeros. And ve'erva kalachas la'atzma. So each one went and made an independent Eruvei Chatzeros so that they should be allowed to transfer kelim sheshavsu babayis to the chotzer, keli sheshavas bachotzer to the bait, to the bottom, transfer from one house in the chotzer to another house in the chotzer, etc., etc. So when Shabbos started, everything is fine. These two chatzeros are completely independent of each other. They each went ahead and made a perfectly proper Eruvei Chatzeros. Now what happened, says the Mechaber, v'nifratz ha'koisel b'Shabbos. And now the wall that separates the two chatzeros becomes breached on Shabbos. How much was it breached? Says the Chavetz Chaim in the Bir Halacha, Dibra Maschel v'nifratz ha'koisel b'Shabbos, hainu b'miluoi, meaning, let's say the two chatzeros were relatively small chatzeros, so that where they meet up with each other, it's less than 10 amos. Let's say that area is only 8 amos long, and it was nifratz b'miluoi. So even though that breach is less than a 10 amma breach, but it's a complete breach, right? The two chatzeros are wide open to each other. Well, if it's nifratz b'miluoi, even if the opening is less than 10 amos, the two chatzeros are completely breached to each other. So now they're one big chatzer, they're going to aser on each other. Or, says the Chavetz Chaim, if they're larger chatzeros, let's say they're very big chatzeros, let's say it's 100 amos where the two chatzeros meet, but the breach is, says the Chavetz Chaim, oy b'yeser me eser amos. But somewhere in middle of this mechitza, the mechitza became breached in an area that's longer than 10 amos. Well, once a breach is longer than 10 amos, it negates the entire mechitza, because once you exceed 10 amos, you're no longer a Pesach. So now, jumping right back into the Mechaber, so that's the scenario. There was a wall between the two chatzeros. Therefore, they each made a separate, independent Eruvei Chatzeros. But now, but now the wall between them became seriously breached on Shabbos, so that now they're open to each other. If they open to each other, they're gonna aser on each other. But this happened on Shabbos. What's the halacha, says the Mechaber? Mutter l'taltel kol ha-Shabbos, kol echad b'chatzeroi, afilu klei habayis. Since at the outset of Shabbos, by Ben Hashmashos, when the Erev was activated and kicked in, each chotzer had a proper Eruvei Chatzeros. Now we're going to apply the rule, Shabbos Kevin Shehutra Hutra, and we're going to carry on for the rest of Shabbos the same way we did. Each chotzer is going to be seen as having a kosher Eruvei Chatzeros. Each chutzner could keep on transferring from a keli sheshavas babayis from the houses to the chutzner, a keli sheshavas b'chutzner from the chutzner to the houses. They could transfer from one house to the other within their own chutzner. Obviously, they can't transfer from a keli sheshavas babayis in one chutzner to the chutzner of the other chutzner, or to a house in another chutzner. Obviously, that you can't do. These two chatzeros are not joined in a joint eruve chatzeros, but we're not going to negate the eruve chatzeros that kicked in at the onset of Shabbos. We're not going to look at it and say, oh no, now the two chatzeros are breached to each other, so now there's two entities here, now they aser on each other, and the eruve chatzeros is bottle. We're not going to say that. Shabbos kevin shehutra, hutra. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Zayin. Even though each chotzer is now breached to a different rishus, it's breached to another chotzer, and they don't have a joint eruve chatzeros. They couldn't. They had a wall between them. They have a nifratz l'makom ha'asalai, so now they're breached to an area that asers on them. They're breached to another chotzer, so that should aser on them. If it was like that before Shabbos, they couldn't make two separate independent eruve chatzeros. They're open to another chotzer. Nevertheless, kevin sheben hashmashos hayamuter, since at ben hashmashos with Shabbos cave in, it was muter. Huter l'chol Shabbos, it remains muter for the duration of Shabbos. And this allows each chotzer to keep on transferring kelim sheshavsu babayis to the chotzer, to their chotzer, vice versa. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ches v'afilu klei abayis di'ilu klei chotzer mutar l'taltal af b'chotzer l'chotzer gam kishenifratz. If we're talking about kelim sheshavsu b'chotzer, if we're talking about lawn chairs that started out Shabbos in one of the chatzeros, you could transfer that lawn chair anywhere in the chotzer. You could also transfer it even to the other chotzer. Because remember, you don't need an eruve chatzeros to transfer kelim sheshavsu b'chotzer from one chotzer to another chotzer. Kol hagagin v'hakatzeros v'hakapifos kulan rishus achadheim. The kol hachatzeros rishus achas l'kedola'el bereish siman shin ayin beis. Okay, so the first halacha here in today's shir was very, very basic. You have two chatzeros separated by a kaisel. The kaisel came down on Shabbos. High level, you would look at this situation and you would say that the eruve chatzeros should be bottled. Why should it be bottled? Because very nice that before Shabbos the two chatzeros were separated and they each made an independent eruve chatzeros, but now they're wide open to each other. They're breached either yoser be'eser amos, either there's a breach that's larger than 10 amos, it's no longer a pesach, it negates the entire mechitza, or it's nifratz b'miluai. So now the two chatzeros are open to each other, they should aser on each other. But they don't. Why? Because the breach occurred on Shabbos. So at Ben Hashmashos, everything was copacetic. It continues that way. The status quo continues. Shabbos kevin shehutra hutra. But now, having said that, the Mechaber is just going to mention another halacha, which is really a halacha that we had earlier in, I'm thinking, Shin Mem Vav. Let me just check that I'm right. No, not Shin Mem Vav, Shin Samach? Time for Chazar. No. Shin Samach Gimel? Oh, come on, what's the matter with me? All right, I'm not going to spend time. Shin Samach Aleph. Shin Samach Aleph Siv Beis. Says the Mechaber now. Says the Mechaber. I lost the place. Aval. Second line down, middle of the line, right by the Ois test for the Mishnah Berurah. Aval, however, says the Mechaber. Chotzer shenifritza b'Shabbos l'rishus harabim. Let's say you have a chotzer that abuts the rishus harabim. And now the wall that separates the chotzer from the rishus harabim is nifratz. The wall comes down. A car took it out on Shabbos. And again, it took out a section that's more than 10 amos long, or it took out the entire wall if it's less than 10 amos long, so it's nifratz b'miluai to the rishus harabim. Oy lekarmelis, or let's say you have a chotzer that abuts not a rishus harabim but a karmelis, right? And now the mechitza that separates the chotzer from the karmelis comes down. Aser, now tiltal will be aser. Now before we even go to the rishus harabim, before we even go to the Mishnah Berurah, let's just do some basic math over here. Some basic chelik daled math. You have a chotzer. The chotzer is surrounded, it's mukaf daled bechitzos. So the chotzer is a rishus hayachid daraisa. It abuts onto a rishus harabim. And we're talking about a rishus harabim daraisa, bona fide rishus harabim, 16 amos wide, makom hiluch shishim ribu, etc., etc. Makom hiluch harabim. To transfer from a rishus hayachid to a rishus harabim is an issa daraisa, right? Now, a car came and it rammed into the wall that separates the chotzer from the rishus harabim. It took out the wall. It breached the wall more than 10 amos, or it took out the entire wall. It's nifratz b'miluay l'rishus harabim. Okay, take a breath. What's the status of the inside of that chotzer? Well, the chotzer is still mukaf gimel mechitzos. So midaraisa, according to most Rishonim, and seemingly the Mechaber basically paskins that way, the chotzer is still a rishus hayachid daraisa, because it's mukaf gimel mechitzos. The Rambam requires 4 mechitzos, but other Rishonim, 3 mechitzos is still a rishus hayachid daraisa. So now we have a rishus hayachid daraisa that is nifratz, it's completely breached, to a rishus harabim daraisa. Okay? Now, inside a rishus hayachid daraisa, you're allowed to be metaltal yoyser midal amos, right? But not if it's nifratz b'miluay to a rishus harabim. If it's nifratz l'makom ha'aserloi, if it's nifratz to a rishus harabim, the inside of that chotzer now becomes a karmelis. Now you're only allowed to be metaltal up to dalet amos inside the chotzer. Why? Because the chotzer is now a karmelis. Since it's completely breached to a rishus harabim, it now becomes a karmelis. That's what the Mechaber means here in his first case of the second half of Sif Beis. You have a chotzer that's completely breached to a rishus harabim. Now we're going to downgrade the inside of the chotzer from being a rishus hayachid, even though it's a rishus hayachid daraisa. We're now going to make it a karmelis. Now, having said that it's a karmelis, should you transfer from inside that chotzer to the rishus harabim, it would be an issa daraisa, not an issa darabanan, of transferring from a karmelis to a rishus harabim. Because with daraisa, it's a rishus hayachid. What do I mean that we're making it a karmelis? We're making it a karmelis l'chumra, that you're not allowed to be metaltal yoyser midalet amos inside that chotzer. That if you are metaltal yoyser midalet amos inside that chotzer, it would be an issa darabanan. But to transfer from inside the chotzer to the rishus harabim, or from the rishus harabim to the inside of the chotzer, is a daraisa. The second case of the second half of Sif Beis over here is when it became breached to a karmelis. All right, so now let's do that math. The inside of the chotzer is a rishus hayachid daraisa. It's mukaf gimel mechitzos. Outside is a karmelis. Since it's breached l'makom ha'aserloi, since now this chotzer, which is a rishus hayachid daraisa, is breached to a karmelis, again, it's breached l'makom ha'aserloi. So now tiltal yoyser midal amos is going to become aser inside the chotzer. How about to transfer from inside the chotzer to the karmelis? That gets tricky. Take a look at the Bir Halacha, Dibra Mascha LeKarmelis Aser, where the Chavetz Chaim writes, Ein bebeis Yosef shekasav, Dahainu she'aser l'taltal b'sech ha'chotzer yoyser mi'arba amos. Since the chotzer is completely breached to a karmelis, we're now going to give it the din of a karmelis l'chumra, and we're going to say that you're not allowed to be metaltal yoyser midal amos inside the chotzer, because we're going to make it a karmelis. Aval b'soich arba amos mutter afilu l'taltal mimenu lekarmelis. But you're allowed to transfer, says the Beis Yosef, from inside the chotzer out to the karmelis, as long as you remain within dalet amos. So you want to pick up something inside the chotzer, walk 2 amos to the border between the chotzer and the karmelis outside, cross the border, and go another 2 amos inside the karmelis, so you are metaltal less than dalet amos. That you're allowed to do, even though you're transferring from a rishus hayachid to a karmelis. Very interesting, right? Not allowed to go from a Rishus HaYachid to a Karmelis. But in that case, the Beis Yosef says, since inside is a Rishus HaYachid, outside Midaraisa is a Makom P'tur, right? Karmelis Midaraisa is a Makom P'tur. It's a Chumrah that we make it a Karmelis, right? But since the outside is a Karmelis, and now we're giving the inside the din of a Karmelis, in what way are we giving the inside the din of a Karmelis? Because we're saying you're not allowed to be Metaltal Yosef V'Dalad Amis inside the Chotzer. They're both Karmelis. You could go from one Karmelis to the other. That's the opinion. That's the opinion that the Beis Yosef brings down. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, Magen Avram is Stapik Bazeh. Magen Avram, not so sure. The Efsher Daf Apikein Shem Chotzer Alav. Because, hey, it's a Rishus HaYachid, the Raisa still. It's got 3 mechitzas. So maybe it's still a Rishus HaYachid, and you can't go from a Rishus HaYachid to a Karmelis. Okay, at the end of this Bir Halacha, he says, V'alkein nira she'ein la'akal. Now, there are precedents that we've had before. I don't know if I could find it very, very quickly. There are precedents that we had before where we said that you could go from a Karmelis to, come on. All right, I have to find it, but we did have precedent before where we said, I have to find it. We had precedent when we were talking about a karpef, where we spoke about a karpef yoyse mibeis asayim. So a karpef yoyse mibeis asayim she'enu hukaf ledira. It's a very large area. It's mukaf dalid mechitzais. It's the Rishus HaYachid daraisa. But we give it a din of a Karmelis, and we say that you're not allowed to be metaltal more than dalid amis inside the karpef. But we said that if it's breached to a Karmelis, you could go. If it's completely breached to a Chotzer, you could go back and forth. I have to find it. So there is precedent. I really thought I could find it quickly. It's time for Chazar. Shin Mem Vav Sif Gimel on Reish Amud Aleph. Karpef Yosef Mibeis Asayim Shaloi Hukaf Ledira Asr Chachamel Taltal Boy Elotoich Arba Amoy, say they made it a Karmelis. But Umuter Lahoitzi Mimenu LeKarmelis Acher Kegoin Bika Iveris Lafanov. So you have a Karpef Yosef Mibeis Asayim Shaloi Hukaf Ledira Midaraisa is the Rishus HaYachid. We give it a din of a Karmelis. Why? Because since it's very, very large, somebody might confuse it with a Rishus HaRabim. They see you being metaltal Yosef V'Dalad Amis inside this karpef. They're going to think it's mutter to be metaltal Yosef V'Dalad Amis in a bona fide Rishus HaRabim. So we give the karpef Yosef V'Beis Asayim Shaloi Hukaf Ledira, we give it a din of a Karmelis. What if this karpef borders on a bika? Right, the rolling plains of grain that we used to speak about. That bika is a makom p'tur midaraisa, but midarabanan it's a Karmelis, right? We said you're allowed to go from the karpef to the Karmelis. So here we have a case, a precedent, where we have the karpef, which is a Rishus HaYachid daraisa, because it's mukaf daled bechitzais, and you're allowed to transfer to the bika, which is a Karmelis. Right? Because since we make the karpef a Karmelis, we say that you could go from the Karmelis to the Karmelis. That could be seen as a precedent for the halacha that we have over here in Sif Beis. We have this chotzer that borders on the Karmelis, borders on a bika. The wall of the chotzer came down. It's a Rishus HaYachid daraisa, like the karpef in Shin Mem Vav. It's a Rishus HaYachid daraisa, right? But we're giving it a din of a Karmelis that you're not allowed to be metaltal Yosef V'Dalad Amis. But, says the Beis Yosef, to go from one to the other, as long as you remain within Dalad Amis, that would be mutter. But you see over here, we have a machlokes achronim over here brought down in this Bir Halacha. Okay, Let's go back to the Mishnah Berurah that we didn't see yet. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut and test. Aval karmelis aser. Bazelo yamrinan kevich hutra hutra. Kamay darminan meikara. The reason why the Mechaber brings this halacha down here in Sif Beis is because in the beginning of Sif Beis we gave a case where there was a mechitza between two chatzeros. The mechitza was nifratz on Shabbos, and we ignore the fact that the mechitza was nifratz on Shabbos. We say Shabbos kevich hutra hutra. That's why he tells us in the second half of Sif Beis, but what if you have a mechitza that came down between a chotzer and a rishus harabim, or a chotzer and a karmelis? Do we say, status quo, Shabbos kevich hutra hutra? No, over here we do not say status quo. Over here we say, now there's a halachic change. Now suddenly you're not allowed to be metaltal yosef b'dalad amas inside the chotzer. We're going to give it the din of a karmelis l'chumra. And explains the Mishnah Berurah, Tesham lo nifratz ela l'chotzer shehu rishus hayachid kamayu. Because in the first case of Sif Beis, two chatzeros became breached one to the other. Chotzer A is a rishus hayachid, Chotzer B is a rishus hayachid. Ve'ein beineim ela shezehu shel yachid zeh v'zehu shel acher. The only difference between Chotzer A and Chotzer B is that Chotzer A belongs to one entity, the HOA of Chotzer A that made an Eruv Chatzeros, and the HOA of Chotzer B that made an Eruv Chatzeros, but they're both Rishos HaYachids. Aval zeh shenifratz to Rishos HaCheres Mamish. But when we're talking about a Chotzer that's nifratz to a Rishos HaRabim or to a Karmelis, over there, when the Mechitza comes down, the Chotzer is being opened to a different type of Rishus. It's being breached either to a real Rishus HaRabim or to a Karmelis. Lo yamrina bei hoil v'hutra hutra. Now we cannot say hoil v'hutra hutra. V'ayin b'bir halacha dibra maskala Karmelis that I explained to you already outside. Okay, moving along to Sif Gimel. Sif Gimel is going to require a little bit of artwork. Okay, says the Mechaber Sif Gimel. Chotzer Ktana, you have a small Chotzer, shenifratza koidim Shabbos bimilua, that became completely breached before Shabbos, ligadola, to a larger chotzer. Ve'ein bepirtza yoser me'eser amos. But the area where the small chotzer became opened to the bigger chotzer is less than 10 amos wide. Gedola muteres lahaitzi kelim sheshafsu bayis lechatzera. Within the chotzer gedola, you're allowed to continue transferring a keli sheshavas babayis to the chotzer or vice versa. Im irva la'atzma, assuming that they made their own independent uruv chatzeros or ketana asura, and in the chotzer ketana it's aser lahaitzi kelim sheshavsu babayis lechatzera ela imkain ervu yachad, unless they made their own Eruv Chatzeros. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's take a look at what we're talking about over here. Okay, so here we have Chotzer Ktana and Chotzer Gedola. Okay? I want you to ignore this Mechitza and this Mechitza. These two short walls. Ignore those for the moment. That's going to come up soon in the Mechaber. Right now, what I want you to pay attention to is the Chotzer Ktana, and it's opened up to the Chotzer Gedola, which is larger than it, right? Says the Mechaber like this. These two Chatzeros became completely breached, meaning, let's say there had been a wall over here, separating the Chotzer Ktana from the Chotzer Gedola. That wall is gone, and that wall was gone already before Shabbos. So at the outset of Shabbos, we have two chatzeros that are opened, I'm not going to say to each other, but definitely the Ketana is completely opened to the Gdola. So now, if the people of the Chotzer Ketana, if the people of these chatzeros want to make it a Ruva Chatzeros, right? Could they each make it independent to Ruva Chatzeros? Well, at first glance, you have very strong reason to say no, right? You have two chatzeros that are open to each other, it looks like. L'chara, they should aser on each other. And if they want to make it a Eruv Chatzeros, they should have to make one big Eruv Chatzeros, one joint Eruv Chatzeros. How could they make separate Eruv Chatzeros? Says the Mechaber, not so fast. If when Shabbos came in, the people of the Chotzer Gedola made their own independent Eruv Chatzeros, then for Shabbos they're okay. Why is that? Very simple. First of all, when we say that these two chatzeros are breached to each other, says the Mechaber, we're talking about a case where ein bepirtza yoiser me'eser amos. This opening is less than 10 amos long. Now, I want you to look at this situation from the perspective of the people in the Chotzer Gdola. From the perspective of the people of the Chotzer Gdola, they have a wall over here, and they have a wall over here, right? So from the perspective of the people in the Chotzer Gdola, there is a wall separating them from the Chotzer Ktana. Now that's not really totally true, because this wall is not separating between the Chotzer Gdola and the Chotzer Ktana. It's separating between the Chotzer Gdola and an area that's outside the Chotzer Ktana. But it doesn't look that way from the perspective of the people inside the Chotzer Gdola. What the people inside the Chotzer Gdola see when they look from the Chotzer Gdola to the Chotzer Ktana, they see that they're walled in on 4 sides. They're walled in on 3 sides completely, and they're walled in on the 4th side partially. And they do have an opening to the Chotzer Ktana, but the opening to the Chotzer Ktana is less than 10 amos wide. Since the opening to the Chotzer Ktana is less than 10 amos wide, what is it? It's not a pirza, it's a Pesach. So the way they look at it is they abut onto a Chotzer Ktana, but they have a wall with a Pesach. What's the halacha when you adjoin another Chotzer and you have a wall and a Pesach? The halacha is, if you want, you could join and adjoin to Rivik Hatzeros, but if you don't, you could make your own independent to Rivik Hatzeros. Therefore, says the Mechaber, in this case, if this opening that's less than 10 amos long was created before Shabbos, then the people in the Chotzer Gdola could make their own independent Rivik Hatzeros, and now on Shabbos they could transfer Kelim Sheshofsu Babayis from the house to the Chotzer. They could transfer Kelim Sheshofsu B'Chotzer from the Chotzer to the house. They could transfer from one house in this Chotzer to another house in the Chotzer, no problem. Can they transfer Kelim Sheshofsu Babayis to the Chotzer Ktana? No, because they didn't join in a joint to Rivik Hatzeros with the Chotzer Ktana. That's all from the perspective of the Chotzer Gdola. But now let's go to the perspective of the Chotzer Ktana. From the perspective of the Chotzer Ktana, they have no walls going from the Chotzer Ktana to the Chotzer Gdola. So even if this is less than 10 amos, doesn't matter. They're nifratz b'miluoi. They have no walls, not even a tefach. On either side, they got nothing. So they're nifratz b'milua to the Chotzer Gdola. Well, if the Ktana is nifratz b'milua to the Chotzer Gdola, they can't make their own independent Rivik Hatzeros. How can they? They're nifratz b'milua to another Chotzer that asers on them. That's the basic halacha that the Mechaber just told us. Now, the Mechaber is going to throw in another caveat. Let's go weiter in the Mechaber before we even do the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 lines off the bottom here on Reish Mem Daled Amud Aleph, right by the Mishnah Berurah, right by the Ois Cut and Yud Zayin for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mechaber, V'hainu, when I'm telling you that the Chotzer Ktana is Aser, when I'm telling you that the Chotzer Ktana cannot make their own independent Rivik Hatzeros, because they're completely breached to the Chotzer Gdola, V'hainu kishenichnasin koslei ktana l'gedola. First requirement for that to be true is what I told you to ignore at first. You see these walls? Says the Mechaber, when is it true that the Chotzer Ktana is considered completely breached to the Gdola, and therefore the Ktana cannot make its own independent Rivik Hatzeros? That's when these side walls of the Ktana extend into the Gdola. The side walls of the Ktana extend into the Gdola, and they bisect these walls that are the walls of the Chotzer Gdola. That was requirement number 1 for this halacha to be true. Requirement number 2, says the Mechaber, ukeshekoslei Ktana muflagim shloisha tfachim mikoslei oirech hagdola. And these walls here that extend from the Ktana into the Gdola, the distance between this wall and this wall, the side walls of the Gdola, has to be more than 3 tvachim. Okay? Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Because if you don't have either one of those, if you don't have these walls here that bisect the walls of the Gdoila, or if you do have them, but they're within 3 tvachim of these side walls of the Gdoila, dim loikein hoisa ktana niteres. Without that, the ktana could also make their own independent derivah chatzeros. Why? Al yedei nira mi bachutz v'shava mi bifnim. Based on the halacha that we've dealt with before, the halacha of nira mi bachutz v'shava mi bifnim. What does that mean? What that means is, and again, we've dealt with this before, there is a concept. If these walls would not be here, right? Wipe them out. Imagine you have this wall meets this wall and turns, and there is no extension over here. In that case, it's true that from the perspective of the people in the Ketana, they're completely breached to the Gdoila. But from the perspective of the people in the Gdoila, they don't see the Ketana as being completely breached to them. Why? Because again, like I said earlier, when they look from the Gdoila to the Ketana, what do they see? They see partial walls on each side. So the halacha is, nire mi bachutz. If from the outside of a chutzner, it looks like there are at least partial walls that close them off from the Gdoila, then even though it's shava mi bifnim, even though from mi bifnim you don't see that, what does shava mi bifnim mean? Shava mi bifnim means from the inside, it looks like this wall, right, ends over here, and it's shave, it's equal to this wall, and this opening is a complete opening. So it's nira mi bachutz v'shave mi bifnim, but that makes us look at the Ketana as being walled off by these walls. So if this wasn't here, if these extensions were not here, we would say that the same way the Gdoila is considered cut off from the Ketana, so the Gdoila could have its own independent derivah chatzeros, so too the Ketana is cut off from the Gdoila, and they could also have their independent derivah chatzeros. But once these extensions are here, we cannot say that. Why? Because now from the perspective of the Ketana, they're cut off, and from the perspective of the Gdoila, they're also cut off. Because now the people in the Gdoila don't see these walls as being partial walls that cut off from the Ketana. Why? Because there's a wall here that cuts it off. There are walls here that bisect it. So they don't look at it as walls that serve to cut them off from the Ketana. The other requirement was that this wall has to be within sheer lavud of this. It has to be distance more than sheer lavud from this wall. Why? Because if this wall was within sheer lavud of this wall, halachically we would connect them and we wouldn't see this wall as even being here. Right? We would just look at it as a piece of this wall over here, and halachically we would not recognize it. Okay, based on that, I think we could take a look at the Mishnah Berurah and do relatively short work of the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut yud shenifritz l'kaidim Shabbos. This wall separating the Gdoila and the Ketana came down before Shabbos. Deal of Shabbos, because let's say the wall separating the Gdoila and the Ketana would fall down on Shabbos. So before Shabbos, they were completely cut off with a wall. They each made an independent derivah chatzeros. Well, then it goes to the halach of Sif Beis. Deal of Shabbos, I'm reading Kevich Hotra. If they had been completely separated before Shabbos, before Ben Hashmashas going into Shabbos, and they each made their own independent derivah chatzeros, and then the wall separating them came down, classic case of Sif Beis. Shabbos Kevich Hotra. They could each carry on status quo. They could each transfer Kelv Shashafs Babayis to their chotzer and vice versa. What happened over here was Bimilua Gedola. The Ketana became completely breached to the Gedola. Says the Mishnah Berurah, said Larma, the Mechabi means to say is, show you smuchas zelazeh, they're next to each other, because of Masik Benayan, they had a wall separating them, Venifratz Kala Kaisel Azeh, and the entire Kaisel came down. Oiskot Yud Beis, Ve'ein Bepertze Yaisam Yaser Amos. We have to be talking about a case where the breach is not more than 10 amos wide. Di'ilu yoiser me asara. If this breach over here is more than, If this breach over here is more than 10 amos wide, then we can't say that the Gdoila is shut off from the Ktana because they have walls over here and this gap is a Pesach. If it's more than 10 amas, it can't be a Pesach. If it's more than 10 amas, it negates this entire wall, and then all bets are off. Then everybody's different b'milui to each other. Neither one can have their own independent derivative chatzeros. If it's more than 10 amas, then we cannot say that the opening between the Gdoila and the Ktani is a Pesach for the Gdoila. The Pesach yosem yeser amas lo yav the inchi, because you don't make a Pesach more than 10 amas long. In this case, the Gdoila, they have their own independent derivative chatzeres. They're good. The Chotzer Ktana does not answer on the Chotzer Gdoila, because we see the Chotzer Gdoila as being cut off from the Chotzer Ktana by virtue of those partial walls, and the gap is only a doorway. Because there are those short partial side walls. Those are gifufin. And the opening to the Ktana is only a Pesach. If you're dealing with lawn chairs that started off Shabbos in either one of the chatzeros, you could move those lawn chairs even from one chatzer to the other. You don't need any ruva chatzeros to go from chatzer to chatzer. If the Gdoila had its own independent ruva chatzeros, they could transfer from the houses to the chatzer to the house, etc., etc., etc. Why? Because why not? They have their own independent derivative chatzeros, and they're not breached to the Ktana. Avalam lo yerva, but of course, if they didn't make the derivative chatzeros, afi asura. Oiskan design uktana asura. But the small chatzer, the chatzer Ktana, is asur. The chatzer Ktana, they're in trouble. The chatzer Ktana is in trouble because they are completely breached to another chatzer. The chatzer Gdoila asurs on them. They're nifratz b'milua, so they're stuck. Even if this is less than 10 amas, doesn't help. It's nifratz b'milua. You don't even have a tefach over here or over here. You don't have a pas arba. You don't have anything. They're nifratz b'milua to this chatzer asers on them. So even if they made their own independent derivative chatzeres, they're cooked. They can't. Nothing can help them. Then the Mechaber threw in two requirements for this halacha to be true. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the Vahainu? When is it true that the Ktana is aser because the Gdoila asers on them? When the side walls of the Ktana extend into the Gdoila, that's when you have a problem. Now the Mishnah Berurah says a phrase that is very difficult to understand. Says the Mishnah Berurah, when the side walls of the Ktana extended to the Gdoila, b'shtayim v'shalosh amos. Those side walls, says the Mishnah Berurah, have to extend into the Gdoila 2 or 3 amos. Very difficult to understand. The Mishnah Berurah blames it on Rashi. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, if you take a look at Shar Hatzion Ois Cotton Yud Beis, he brings this down from Rashi, Daf Tes Amud Aleph. Very difficult to understand. You can take a look. There's a Dirshu footnote over here. Brings down a famous Prima Godim. Prima Godim says 2 or 3 amas. Where does this share come from? No idea where this share comes from. Why does it have to extend 2 or 3 amas? Chazon Ish says it could even be a kolshu. It doesn't have to be 2 or 3 amas. We're going to remain with a tzarchian on this line over here. Okay. And the second requirement, said the Mechaber, was those extensions, the side wall of the Ktana extensions that go into the Gdoila, have to be distanced more than the sheer lavud from the side walls of the Gdoila itself. Dahainu, Makan Knisas Bechitzas HaKtana, where the walls of the Ktana extend into the Gdoila, have to be Muflaga Mikasle Orech HaGdoila Shebetzida. They have to be distanced more than the sheer lavud from the side walls of the Gdoila. Because otherwise we can connect those extensions to the side walls of the G'dayla, and then we would see them as not being separated from the side walls of the G'dayla at all, and that's going to create a problem. This is a major sugya in Erevin. We're saying lavud l'chumra, and it's a funny lavud. Exactly what is this lavud doing? Somehow by saying this lavud, what we're doing is, did it upside down again. What we're doing is, if this is less than the sheer lavud, we're attaching this extension to this. All right, and now what? I mean, the whole basis for the heter over here, right, is for the chumrah. I'm sorry. The whole basis over here is, since these extensions exist, we cannot say nira mi bachutz v'shava mi b'fnim, because even from the perspective of the G'dayla, we don't see these gifufin, we don't see these short partial side walls as serving the Ktana. We don't see them as cutting off the G'dayla from the Ktana from the G'dayla. Therefore, the Ktana is nifras b'milua to the G'dayla. Therefore, the Ktana is aser even if they have their own independent derivah chatzerais, because the G'dayla asers on them. But if this is less than 3 tfachim, we say lavud. We say lavud and what? And somehow we connect this to this, and now it doesn't cut off the gifufin? I don't know. It's a difficult sugya. Okay. Weiter. Ice cutting your test. If you don't have those partial, those extensions cutting off the partial side walls, we would be matir the Ktana to have its own independent derivah chatzerais based on nira mi bachutz v'shava mi b'fnim. Returner Lord what the Mechaber means to say is, if you don't have those extensions where the side walls of the Ktana extend into the G'dayla, the Chotzer Ktana would also be mutter based on it being its own independent Chotzer, because even though it's shava mi b'fnim, meaning sheha'ayimid b'saycha, somebody who's standing inside the Ktana, from the perspective of the Ktana, Roya called Koslei Arka Shavin, they see their side wall as being shaveh. What does that mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, She'ein sham mikaisel rachba l'peiser klum ve'vi'apirtza b'chal milua. They see this as being straight and ending here, and they don't see even a partial wall cutting them off from the G'dayla. So it's shaveh mi bifnim. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, Harei mi bachutz b'saycha G'dayla nirin lo shirei kaisel mikan mikan. But from the perspective of the G'dayla, they see the gifufin as cutting them off from the Ktana. Hainu oisei oidev shag'dayla oidefes al Ktana. That's this piece over here. Those are the gifufin, right, where the G'dayla is bigger than the Ktana. These side walls, right, where the G'dayla is bigger than the Ktana. Those are partial walls. So from the perspective of the G'dayla, they are partially cut off from the Ktana. And that would be v'niteres b'hem, tishteri gam Ktana. So then the Ktana becomes mutter. Masha'enken kishaboltin kosli Ktana l'sech G'dayla. But now that the side walls of the Ktana extend into the G'dayla, nikar she'oisat shirei kaisel shal G'dayla oimden me'acharei pritzes Ktana ein shaykh lozeh. Now that these extensions go into the G'dayla, even from the perspective of the G'dayla, they see that these walls are not serving to cut them off from them. No, because they terminate over here. So we don't see this as being something that cuts off from here. No, now we don't see it anymore, and now it's not going to be able to serve as a divider. I was hoping we would be able to finish the Siman, but it looks like it's not to be. But Sif Dalid is really very much a repeat. It's just another permutation of the same halacha. Hopefully we'll move through it quickly in the next year. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The source of Liman HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua Sephorus Parnasset Shadukam Tolos in need. We should be zeichet to see the BS Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.